Hello everyone, Mr. Mueller here. I hope things are going well with you. Again, stay healthy, stay safe. What I'm going to call these are called 7 minutes of statistics. And why I'm labeling it that is because each video is going to be no longer than 7 minutes. It's either going to be 7 minutes or less. And what I'll do is, how I label these is, I'm going to label it with a learning target. Like this will be 9.3. I'm going to label it with an episode number. So if you want to look at them, you can just go right down the line, episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. And then after each episode number, I'm going to go ahead and put a description as a notes. Is it an example? What number of example is it? What part is it? So you can easily go through these. And if you want to, when you get to the examples, if you understand it after one example, you can just bypass the other ones and so forth. But again, these are going to be no longer than 7 minutes. So 7 minutes of statistics. What we're going to do starting today is kind of begin where we left off. I know when we first started target 9.3, which was being able to describe and apply the central limit theorem for sampling distributions, we had done some activities, and we might refer back to those as we go through here. However, as you'll see, that I'm going to bypass all these examples because we've already done them all. So I'm going to skip through this. If you have any questions on this, you can get back to me. But I think we pretty much covered everything in those that we needed to do. So also what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, or excuse me, I'm not going to. I want you to pause the video to be able to read through stuff, or if you need to copy something down or make a note to yourself. You can always go back and rewatch this. So if I want you to read through this, go ahead and pause the video, read through it, and then we'll get going. So again, you know, when we left off, we were kind of looking at what we call sampling distributions. Now, again, what a sampling distribution is you're not looking at individual values in a population. You're looking at samples of the same size and looking at some statistic, either the sample mean or sample proportion for each of those samples of the same size. And then what you're going to do is you're going to group all of those samples together and look at, again, we were talking about the sample mean when we left. So again, we're looking at sampling distributions here. We're looking at collections of samples of the same size and plotting, for instance, the mean of each of those samples as we did in class before we left. And I want to make note of this. I will read this to you. The population is like parents, and sample statistics are like children. We all know how parents behave, and now we want to study the behavior of their children. Also, we can use the behavior of the children to be able to know how the adults behave. So we've been looking at how a population is, and look at how are the samples behaving with respect to the population, if you know the population. We'll also look at the other way, and this is where inferential statistics come in. If we don't know how the population behaves, we can look at samples and how they behave to be able to determine how the population behaves. Okay, now we also talked a little bit about this, and I'll describe this diagram. For instance, we're going to talk about sampling means. So what we would do is we would randomly select values from a population where the population mean is mu. So for instance, we take our first sample of some size, could be, let's say, for instance, 20, and we get a sample mean. We take another sample. This is what each of you were doing when you were generating samples of the same size when you left class. Sample mean is a sample 2. We get its mean. We take sample 3. We get its mean. Now remember, all of these samples have to be the same size. You can't have a sample of 20 and then a sample of 3. They'd all have to be the same size. Now, as we looked at, what happens here is that if you go ahead and take all those sample means and you graph them, you get approximately a bell-shaped normal curve that is centered on wherever the population mean was centered on, but the variability, the spread of it tends to change. The larger these sample sizes are, then the more narrow and thinner this distribution over here tends to get, okay? And we have, again, we've talked about that before. Switch back here. So I want you to go ahead and read through this. So one thing I'm going to want you to understand is that even though we may not be replacing, in other words, if we choose somebody from the population, we really don't want to choose them again, we are going to assume independence in this case. In other words, our sampling processes are going to involve replacement. Why is that? Because for a couple reasons. Number one, the population is so large that whether you decide to replace somebody after you choose them or not, the differences in our values are going to be very, very minute. So it's basically going to be the same. Secondly, when we calculate and analyze the data, it's going to be easier to do that, assuming that we're using independent events. So again, we're going to assume independence. We're going to sample with replacement because the differences between the two ways of replacing or not replacing are very minute, and it's easier to calculate when you do have independence.